Hello, my name is Tina Musuya. Thank you very much for joining us. With me, I will let my other colleagues also introduce themselves. I work with Center for Domestic Violence Prevention in Uganda. Evelyn?
Thank you very much, Tina, and thank you all for who have joined us for this discussion. My name is Evelyn Letio, and I am a GBV specialist. I work as a consultant for IOM and a host of different organizations, including Raising Voices. And we were meant to have a third person, Noel, to be with us as one of the facilitators, but Noel is unable to join us directly. I'm hopeful that she's on the call. She promised us that she will be on and try her best to be on the call. Noel has some family issues to attend to, but she was part of this process and helped in putting this presentation together.
And because we have a lot of things to cover this afternoon, we request that everyone who is on the call, please just write into your text box to tell us the reason as to why you're on this call. And then, while the chat is going on, if you have a question that you would like to throw to the panel, you can use your chat box to write directly as the sessions go on, because at the end of the session, when we are done, we shall have a Q&A session. Is that okay with everyone? And you can use the raise up hand function on the Zoom when the time for the Q&A comes, because then you'll be picked and then you unmute yourself to raise your questions. If you prefer not to use the microphone, that is also okay. Feel free to write your question again within the text box. It will be responded to. Thank you. So we can move on to the next slide. I will begin by quickly telling everyone who COFEM is, but my assumption is you may have read. But this is a coalition of feminists for social change, in short COFEM, which is a collective of over 150 activists, academics, and practitioners working globally to end violence against women and girls, also referred to as GBV. And that's our website address. Next. The reason as to why COFEM came in place is because, thanks to the critical work of women's rights movements, significant progress has been made over the last 3 decades to address violence against women and girls. And yet over the last decade, women's rights activists have seen the space for feminist informed violence against women and girls work shrinking, putting hard-won gains in danger. We began by having discomfort about some of the examples that we were seeing, and then when we started the conversation, we actually saw that this is a big problem. Next. There are concrete things that we need everyone who is on this call to look deeply into, to see why we must infuse a feminist perspective in the work that we are doing. We need to reclaim space for women-centered and women-led and rights-driven work on violence against women and girls in humanitarian and development settings. There is also we need to strengthen and spread a feminist analysis of how to better include men and boys, because that's a key thing. Everyone is asking, how about the men and boys in violence against women and girls efforts? So they remain, the most important thing is they need to remain accountable to women and girls. And also to promote theory and programming, linking gender inequality and violence against women and girls, or GBV. The work with other specialists to ensure initiatives addressing different forms of violence don't create victimhood competition. I think these are key reasons as to why COFEM is in existence, and we have to infuse feminist perspective into the programming. Next. So for COFEM, there's the learning and advocacy tools, and we've come up with COFEM Feminist pocketbooks about some of the key issues that we shall be talking about within this Knowledge Summit. That's the link. And then also we have some papers that we wrote for the SBRI and some video series. So you can follow those links to get more of the issues that we are talking about. Next. Today we are having the Knowledge Summit, which is mainly about staying accountable to women and girls. And as you saw, Evelyn and I are going to be telling you a lot about the issues that we've already seen, and then things from practice. Today we are on our second topic, which is about staying accountable to women and girls. And that's what's going to form the discussions this afternoon. Evelyn, please go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Tina. And I think we now have a sense of what COFEM is, and also some of the discussions and topics that we'll be talking about in the next couple of days as part of our activities for 16 Days of Activism. So we're going to jump straight into the discussion around accountability to women and girls, and maybe kind of like start asking ourselves, what exactly is this thing we're calling accountability to women and girls? And what does it mean in development and humanitarian settings? Often in a lot of the proposals that we see, people throw around the words of we are accountable to affected populations, we are accountable to ensuring the needs of women are met. And then you see, we have small meetings with women, we have this, but then we just kind of like want to delve into that a little bit from a feminist perspective. And from a feminist perspective, accountability means a couple of things. The first thing that we see as accountability to women and girls is being able to deliberately seek out for the voices of women and find them in those difficult places where they are found, and go ahead and act on those voices. But also beyond just finding the voices and listening to them, we want to be able to create opportunities that support women in positions of leadership and see women not just as spectators and as groups to be targeted, but people that genuinely influence the processes that we are engaging them in, whether it is programming, whether it is advocacy, whether it is funding, but that women are active agents and that their leadership is seen in the things that we do. And what that actually means is recognizing that for us to be able to put women at the center of our work and truly be accountable to them, we must be able to understand the systemic hierarchy, the systemic issues, in particular patriarchy, and be able to challenge the systems where we see women holding subordinate position and systems where we see men having power over women that doesn't allow women to engage in the ways in which they would be engaging. And what that also goes ahead to mean for us in doing this work is that we must critically engage all parts of the society to be able to challenge patriarchy. So moving from working with individuals to working with the community to working with the society, so that change happens and the status quo between women and men is actually, changed, and there is balance of power between women and men. And I think what we want to talk more about, which we will see evolving in the other slides, is that in working with all sectors of the community, from the individual to the community to the society, we want to be able to deliberately recognize that accountability to women and men, accountability to women and girls is actually about changing the way in which women and men, girls and boys relate. And that means working with men in ways that can hold them accountable, in ways that can genuinely prevent violence against women, in ways that can genuinely promote gender equality. And of course, at the societal level, it also means examining our funding decisions and ensuring that we prioritize programs and activities that truly hear out the voices of women and girls and put them at the center of the work that they're doing. Next slide. So basically, when we are talking about a feminist approach, perhaps there are two important things that I'd like to emphasize. That feminist approach to accountability basically is looking at challenging and changing patriarchy and the systems around it that reinforce it. So we want to be able to say accountability to women and girls is doing work in a way that changes the position of women and is able to give women power across the spectrum, from power within their own lives, to power at the community level, to power at the societal level, to power at the global level. And we want to be able to know that in working and putting a feminist perspective, women are the center and the structures around it need to change. And a lack of that, basically what it means is that we work in a way that privileges men, which is quite very common. Like I see situations and programs where we are working with leaders, religious leaders, most of them men. We are working with traditional leaders, most of them men. We are working with NGOs, most of them led by men. And then sometimes we are not very aware and very deliberate in challenging some of the attitudes that come from those men who are already in positions of power by virtue of being men, and now have systems and have institutions that even empower them further. So how we are able to really understand that is core for us if we are talking about staying accountable to women and girls. Next slide. So I would like to kind of like take some time to talk about some practices that sort of really demonstrate a lack of accountability to women and girls. And I'm going to speak specifically in perspective of working with men to prevent violence against women and girls. Am I saying that we shouldn't be working with men to prevent violence against women and girls? Certainly no. For a very long time, we have been reaching out and in holistic community mobilization saying that we must involve both women, men, children, adolescents, and everybody to be able to meaningfully do social norm change work. But what we begin to see is that there are trends in working with men that are actually not promoting accountability to women and girls. And one of them is this investment in working with men that's not evidence-based and not demand-driven. So I like to say that these days we have the concept of what about men? So every time there is a discussion of violence against women, what about men? Every time we start talking about the need to have livelihood support for women, what about men? And that kind of discussion takes us away from what we know, from the analysis that we know, from the power imbalances that exist. And we sometimes fall into that because we fear the repercussion of not engaging men. So if we do not base our decisions, our funding on working with men on evidence, then truly we are not being accountable to women and girls. And then we also have a lot of male-dominated efforts that do not necessarily support women's leadership. So we, for example, have so many organizations that are the human rights organizations that we work with. And most of them are funded and started by men. And when you look at the structures of those organizations, we barely have women in leadership position. And the men are not deliberately trying to foster women's leadership in those organizations. We were a few days ago having discussions about women within the UN. And we were saying within most of the UN agencies, we have women rights. But if you look at the women that are at the top echelons of the UN, who are the P5s, the D1s, very few women will surface. The middle management, you sit in a senior management meeting, but you don't see a lot of women. If you go to the community level, it's the same thing. So when we have a male-dominated efforts that do not support women's leadership, then we are actually not being accountable to men. And then there is also now the shift towards men's priorities. And we are beginning to see discussions that are coming and efforts towards recognizing men's suffering, men's vulnerability. Now we need International Day for men. 40% of men are experiencing gender-based violence. All men are now, suffering from mental health. Now, it is not that they don't do. I think they do. But I think when we start pitting women's rights against men's rights and beginning to say men also have these needs, then it totally takes us away from really, really responding to the needs and to the human rights of women and girls, and that is not staying accountable to them. And finally, most times we find ourselves in situations where we do work that does not call out patriarchy. And so we are looking at individual instances of those few men that raped women, of those few women that are not lucky enough to have gone to school. But what is the systemic nature of oppression that women are experiencing, and how are we knitting the threads to be able to see there is women who don't have sexual reproductive rights, women who are experiencing violence, women who are not able to get business loans? Like, how do we put those things together and call the root cause of it, which is challenging and transforming patriarchy and how women and men relate in society? So if we are not able to look at some of these things, then in our programming, we will be doing injustice to women, and we are not being accountable to women and girls. Next slide.
So that's a little quote that I'm not going to read. I would just like everyone to look at it for a few seconds, and then we move on to the next, and I will give some very quick reactions about that. Can we move to the next slide? Again, just take a look at that. So basically what we are saying here is we need to stop feeling guilty and shy of challenging injustice, because what is happening right now, like Evelyn was saying, there's tendency now to pick on gender neutral terminologies like gender-based violence to mean men and women, because there are people who are already raising issues like men are being forgotten. Men are so silent for a very long time. And then we are seeing that some of the programming is forgetting addressing the systemic injustices brought about by patriarchy, by just leaving things within a written kind of framework. Like, for example, in my country here in Uganda, the Men Engage network has a very good documentation about being accountable to women. But between you and I, a whole group of them don't believe at all in women's rights. They still were behind, for example, the Men Engage strategy in Uganda, which is like framing the next steps of working on gender-based violence. And here it's about the priorities of men, about like Evelyn was saying, setting a contest between women's needs and men's needs and men's rights, with the assumption that the current GBV programming has disempowered men. And we are already seeing very retrogressive policies coming in action and a lot of backlash towards women's rights promotion. Let's move to the next slide.
So we would like
to,
yes, please. Yes, thank you, Tina. So we would like to talk a little bit about some of the guiding principles for accountability to women and girls. What are those things that should be at the back of our mind as we work with women and girls, whether we are programmers, practitioners, researchers, donors, and all that. So the first one for next slide So the first one is about prioritizing the rights and needs of women. And by this, we actually mean that the goals of what we do should be defined by women's rights. And in this case, we need to be able to look at a human rights framework, and that the entitlements that women are entitled to by being human beings, and not look at things that we're doing for women as favors, and move away from tokenism to genuinely looking at women as, you know, the 50% of the population, and equal in dignity and in rights with men. And we also are saying, in prioritizing the rights and needs of women, our programming should be designed with women's participation and leadership to ensure their rights and needs are genuinely captured. And I think we will talk later about some examples where we have seen programming and advocacy efforts where this has not happened. Next slide. The other principle that is critical is that of do no harm. And this is a principle that's really critical in working with women and girls. And sometimes I feel like what we understand by do no harm is very shallow, or sometimes perhaps it has become a buzzword that we don't pay particular attention to. So from the angle of being accountable to women and girls, what do we exactly mean? We actually are saying that we want to be able to do work that does not harm women. And so if, for example, you are providing services that are not confidential in one way or another, then you need to be able to ask yourself, do you really need to be able to do this? Are you not worsening the situation of women at the end of the day? If we are doing prevention activities without having a response angle, and people are opening up and we're not able to support them, should we be doing this kind of program? But I think the other one, which is even more silent, is how we work with organizations that do not necessarily promote women's rights. And my struggle in working with very many partners is that sometimes we are looking for the big organizations that have the checklists that meet our procurement or our financial requirements. So are they hacked assessed? Do they have 5 years of existence? Do they have audited reports? Do they have all these kind of things? And sometimes in the process of doing that, we are ignoring the small women's rights organizations that do not necessarily have this kind of paperwork and have the clout that we are looking for. And so we start partnering with these organizations that are not focusing on women's rights, that are not doing their work based on a feminist analysis, and they are not infusing feminist values in the work that we're doing. And so we start to see these organizations replicating patriarchy, right from within themselves as an agency, but also within their communities, because this understanding and some of these things that we are talking about here is alien to them. So being careful about which organizations do we exactly work with, and how are they questioning power within themselves as an organization, and how are they promoting power within the communities that they are working in, both from the way in which they relate with this community, and particularly with women and girls, and the way in which they facilitate relationship between men and women at the community level. So just being aware of both the direct and the indirect harm that we might be able to do if we do not abide by some of the principles that we are talking about. Next slide. So the other one is about promoting women's leadership and inclusion. And I think this one is really, really challenging, especially in the global South, where very many women haven't gone to school, where sometimes there is conflict, and it's very difficult to find women that have gone to school and the women that write. And so we are always sort of like having the excuses of the reason why we have all social workers in these places, because we are not able to get women that have the minimum education that is required. We want to be able to say that that is a challenge, we know. But if we are talking about accountability to women and girls, we have to figure out ways in which we address some of those challenges, or we work around those challenges, so that we can be able to really speak to the needs of women. So how are we able to actively bring women on board even when they don't speak the English the way we want them to speak? How are we able to hear their knowledge and their views and synthesize them, even if sometimes it doesn't seem to be making a lot of sense? I spoke earlier on about the importance of working with women's rights organizations and fostering activism right from the community level, where people start to challenge, patriarchy and seek alternatives of how women and men can start balancing power. And so in promoting women's leadership, it's really important to prioritize these small women's rights organizations that most times will not be having the skill, and putting in place mechanism, funding to build their capacity so that they are able to understand these issues and to start articulating them across the board. And the data outside there is overwhelming about how women's rights organization and how fostering activism, whether it is for political work or otherwise, has proven to be more effective than sometimes investing in the legislation. I'm not saying it's not important. We certainly want to use different ways, but like really ensuring that we deliberately work with women. And I think, as I spoke earlier on, we want to be able to say that we do not want to continue privileging men and boys against women and girls, but creating a power balance where we are able to bring women to the level where men and boys are. Next slide. So Tina is going to talk about the next principles that are important when we are looking at accountability to women and girls. Tina, over to you.
Thank you, Evelyn. Also, we need to actively challenge gender inequality to transform patriarchy. What is happening right now is trying to remain on the surface, and yet we must address, we are not yet there when it comes to gender inequality and breaking the patriarchy, all the systems that patriarchy brought to the fore. So all the work on GBV should be informed by a strong gender power analysis. That's something that we shouldn't shy away from. And this is something that we need to remember. Many people are not taught in school about the actual gender power analysis. So they may have the degrees and the PhDs, but they're gender blind and gender insensitive. So when they're given positions, they will just do things based on how they think and the norms that they grew up with. So we need to focus on the work needs to take into consideration having a very strong gender power analysis, and also to promote a strong understanding of how gender inequality underpins the violence experienced by women and girls in different contexts. Today, we were engaging a group of journalists and other government officials, and the first question they wanted to make us feel guilty was, as always, where are the men? You people have really disempowered men by not talking about men's experiences. Yet in Uganda, the statistics show us that over 60% women experience intimate partner violence, for example. And also sexual violence is extremely high, over 30%. And here are people who are saying, no, now when you start to go deep into addressing patriarchy, we are victims of patriarchy, you shouldn't be focusing on that. But we need to really strengthen people's in-depth analysis of the gender inequality and how this is the root cause of violence. And of course, it gets worse with the other influencing factors. The work that we need to get everyone to understand, and also the programming, to be deliberate about having work that being cognizant that work that does not possess this gender power analysis work that does not have this gender power analysis cannot be accountable to women and girls, because then it will be just setting contest between women's issues and men's issues, and that's not going to help us. we need to be bold and very articulate about that. Next slide. As we can see, there are many factors at play that sustain violence against women and girls. And therefore, there has to be recognition and deliberate efforts to address intersecting and multiple forms of oppression. GBV work needs to be informed by an intersectional understanding of how women and girls may experience various forms of violence and inequality in different ways. Because if a woman, for example, is a woman from the global south here in Africa, she's very poor and maybe with disabilities, with minimal education, her experience is going to be really, I don't even have the right word to say it. If, for example, she's been sexually abused by a very powerful man in government or in politics, she's not going to have any kind of redress given her already vulnerabilities. And also in places where there are issues of racial issues, if, for example, if you're a refugee in a given setting and those intersecting and multiple forms of oppression need to be addressed, because people who are in such circumstances, their experiences are even worse. And the programs to address GBV within a community should be inclusive and accessible to all women and girls, regardless of their disabilities, their race, their ethnicity, religion, and socio-economic background and sexual orientation. Often when you're doing work on GBV, people will dismiss you by saying, you go to the poor rural communities, forgetting that even the women, of course, women who are in those communities are also experiencing lots of forms of violence, but also the ones who are in the elite circles and in the corporate world are either being abused at the workplace or within their own relationships, or they're experiencing all those multiple forms of violence. And maybe within the institutions that they're working in, as Evelyn was saying, their voices are not heard, and their leadership, they are still taking on the gender roles within the workspace. I see it happen a lot here in our region, where the assumption is that even when a woman is of a key position, she should be the one taking the secretarial notes, and the other male colleagues want to be dominant and impose decisions on everything that the women are doing. Next slide. So what does accountability to women and girls look like in practice? We would like to go more practical to see how these things manifest, especially from a feminist perspective. We've tried it and we see it work. Let's go to the next slide. So when it comes to advocacy, we need a strong women's movement where women's leadership and collaboration supports pursuits of shared goals that prioritizes women's rights and needs. We would like all the issues within the country or globally to be, to involve women's movements, to have that feminist perspective into these frameworks, and also the efforts that are being implemented to make sure that whatever is being programmed is taking an affirmative action towards having women's rights realized and needs addressed. And then also women have opportunities to lead and to input into advocacy platforms for gender equality and anti-violence, including when established by male community leaders or policymakers. Unfortunately, we've seen some efforts that, of course, on the assumption that men are the power brokers, now just have the men's perspective. Again, the whole of history of humanity has been almost one-sided with only the men angle. In my communities, even when people go to look for research, they're looking for elders, and elders are only looked at as men from a community. So women's input into research, also at the community level, on things that really affect them, is often excluded on the pretext that they are not elders or they are not holding positions within a given group. So all these efforts need to include women regardless of their education level or economic status or social status. Women's rights organizations need to work in partnership with they need to work in partnership with diverse actors, including marginalized women, to address intersecting forms of inequality and oppression. This is extremely critical because there are very many forms of vulnerability that already compound the women's oppressed position. Next. When it comes to programming, GBV programs and evaluations are developed and implemented in partnership with local or national women's rights organizations. Sometimes these women's organizations may not seem too fancy and super developed in terms of systems, because unfortunately, even the donor groups always assume that women's work should be voluntary. So they are given peanuts, they are given $20,000 to work with a whole district of maybe 1 million people, and they expect results. Now, when they put in funding for even staff funds, they're like, oh, but where is your contribution? These people have been contributing voluntarily and using even their own family resources to do that. So when we go to a community, we need to include even the smallest community-based organizations. They have something to bring to the fore, and we need to strengthen them so they don't die out. Also, program delivery priorities the program delivery should prioritize the safety and well-being of women and girls. We do not have to see programming that creates additional harm or trauma. We've seen some programs here in Uganda where they say, oh, it's the male engage strategy. And these men are also handling case-specific cases at the community level. And once we witnessed a place where women were being caned by the elders because they burnt the food. And they were like, oh, you women are busy gossiping at the neighborhood, so you have to be disciplined. And because the husband had beaten her, and now the elders also gave her about 30 strokes of the cane. So these are extremely harmful kind of programming that we need to ensure that they whatever programs that they are prioritizing the safety and well-being of women. Initiatives with men and boys need to be informed by feminist principles, not only in paper, but also the change within the people who are delivering this programming. They need to be grounded on feminist principles. Because we've had here in Uganda, the group that is within that men engaged cluster saying, oh, for us, we are not feminist, even though their documents read differently. They're like, oh, we are here to make sure that men's needs are taken care of because they've been long forgotten. Again, they are disregarding the women's experiences of abuse and the girls' experiences. Next slide. When it comes to policy, GBV policy making spaces we need to ensure that they are safe and supportive environments for women to lead and to voice ideas and concerns. In the recent past, I keep using my example of Uganda, we've seen retrogressive policies coming up, and I'll highlight a few. One of them is the dress code policy that is saying that women who are sexually abused are responsible for seducing the men given their skimpy dressing. So they've legislated about what a woman should wear, and therefore, if there's a case of sexual harassment or sexual abuse, you're mostly to blame, and there are repercussions for you as a woman. This is very disturbing in a society where they're still normalizing a lot of violence against women. Again, when it comes to the anti-pornography law, again, it is criminalizing the woman's body. It reads nicely on the title, but the provisions in there are again compounding the problem of women. So and mainly because women's input was not taken into this policy making. And unfortunately, the insensitive policies are immediately implemented. The ones that are prioritizing the needs of women, they will dilly-dally around and say there's no funding. Then women from diverse and marginalized backgrounds, women from diverse and marginalized backgrounds need to participate in policy development, and their perspectives need to be incorporated actively in policy documents and decisions. Even when you live in a community like Uganda, for example, that is resistant to things like marital rape, for example, when women participating, you carefully cover it up, but make sure that it's taken care of. The lawyers can now battle it out in courts of law. Like, for example, when we're formulating the Domestic Violence Act, we made sure that the sexual violence, which also constitutes marital rape, is included, even though there was a lot of resistance in the marital rape, in the marriage and divorce law. So these are things that women's participation make a lot of sense too. The GBV laws and policies need to be implemented and enforced in a manner that promotes government accountability to women and girls and their safety. Because if these are not done like that, you will find that laws are being implemented by people who are super insensitive. I'll give an example again. Once we were training police officers, and a big boss of police comes from an FGM practicing community. So he told the officers, look here, I hope that you do not implement this horrible law, because these people are getting on our nerves. These are our traditions. I don't expect any of you, the police officers, to implement this law. Leave us alone, this is our tradition. So you can imagine, this is a law enforcer who knows that FGM is now a crime, but he's telling his junior officers not to implement the law. And this is coming from the point that they are not really trained and grounded on these issues of GBV. And that's a very critical thing. I will hand over back to Evelyn.
Yeah, so we have like a few practical tips that we would like to just share as we move to the Q&A session. And I think perhaps we'll have a couple of people that have questions for us. And so next slide, we'd like to look at some practical tips for practitioners. So if you're here and you are a practitioner, perhaps you're sitting back and saying, oh, what does all this mean for me? And so many things have been said. And there are a couple of things we think that you could start off with. The first one that I think for me is really critical is deliberately and going out of your way to ensure that women and girls meaningfully participate in decision making, whether that's in the community, whether that is in the government, whether that is in your organization, but really asking the question, why are women not part of the processes that we are engaging in? If they are, how come there are a few of them? And if there are a few of them, why is it that they are sitting at the back of the meetings always? Why is it that they are not talking? And sometimes I have found myself getting really radical, where I'm telling organizations that we subgrant that we need a 50-50% representation of staff, at least on your organogram, so that we are able to deliberately grow women in this organization. And I see people giving me this look like, are you not being too radical? But then sometimes I just feel like we really need to sort of like rock the boat to be able to say, if we're talking about women's rights, there are no shortcuts. There are certain things that have to be done, and they have to be done right. If you are in a community meeting as a practitioner and women are in the gardens, you need to be asking yourself, what time do I need to come back? And how can I kind of like really try all possible alternatives and ways to ensure that women are actually part of the processes that we are engaging in? So really ensuring that we are just not doing things for women, but that women are with us and part of the things that we are engaging them on. The other thing that I think is really critical about looking at power and privileges, starting from ourselves, but also from the structures that we work with, and particularly the power and privileges of men. and ensuring that they do not continue disadvantaging and discriminating against women. And so if we are in meetings, being aware that most of the community leaders will be men, and so how do you sit there and recognize power and privilege and deliberately try to see how you can change and look at the underprivileged in the work that you're doing. But more importantly, being able to take some feedback from the work that we're doing. So if we get feedback from our partners, so for example, in humanitarian settings, we're sitting in the subclusters, and most of the times, you know, when they give feedback about the work that we're doing, we are going on defense because we want to tick and appear that we are doing things great. But being able to come to the table with a learning attitude and being able to listen in sometimes some of those difficult things and challenge yourself, especially when it comes to women and girls, on how you can be able to improve their situation. And the other thing which I think we alluded to and Tina has spoken about it is knowing that if we're going to be working with women and girls, and if we're going to be fostering the leadership of women rights organizations that are women-led, it is not going to be food on a silver platter. Most likely, it's going to take a lot of investment from us in terms of capacity building, but also in terms of fostering agency and fostering power. So these women actually believe in themselves. They see themselves as valuable and can kind of like overcome some of the barriers that have been holding them down, so they're able to look at that. And also just recognizing that as a practitioner, there are no quick gains and there are no shortcuts. That our kind of programming, if we are going to see change, if we are going to challenge patriarchy and dismantle the systemic oppression of women, we cannot be talking about 3 months fund, 6 months fund to change social norms. We have to be able to say this work requires long-term systematic investment that will be rocking the boats and be saying some of the difficult things. But if we want to see results, then we should be able to do that. And so I will hand over to Tina to give us a few tips on working with policy makers and donors, and then we will take the question and sessions from you.
Okay, so as we are getting to the close, some tips for the donors and policy makers include the following. It's important to require accountability to women and girls as a core requirement of all GBV programming and policy. I think rather than having just a due diligence for the financial systems, we need to have like a kind of checklist for issues that are ticking on many of the issues that we've been talking about, to check about what is the training and grooming process of the people who are going to do this work. Does their risk register have the points of capturing the harm that may be created? And what's the accountability mechanism that this programming have? And then when it comes to policy, it is still the same thing. We need to have the policy making platforms more sensitive to the needs. We need to be more bold and deliberate about highlighting women's priorities and not getting shy to think that we are annoying the people out there. We are not annoying. We need to make them more uncomfortable so that they can do what is right for the women. Women are really tired. And there's also, it's important to promote partnerships between actors and organizations doing women's rights and GBV work. So diverse voices inform programming, especially in male engagement programs. I will give a unique example from the Ugandan perspective. Here in Uganda, we have a long history of civil society work, and it became really vigilant at the time when HIV was a big scourge here in my country. So many organizations that are doing wonderful work on HIV prevention and response are, yes, doing some work, but most of their work is not grounded on gender power analysis. Now, when the men engage networks say they are working with women's rights organizations, they are not picking on the mainstream women's rights movement. They are picking on women's groups that were working on HIV, which is good, but then they are not addressing the gender power issues. Now that's something that we need to foster collaboration and even require that all the work is working in partnership, not as siloed to the mainstream women's movement. There's a need for heightened accountability. And I think they should not only wait for the women's movement to police them, but they need to be kept in check by themselves because they stand for women's rights and needs. They need to speak to that and even come up to challenge when it's seemingly controversial issues about women's bodies and their rights. And also to ensure funding frameworks prioritize initiatives that are explicit in how they intend to be accountable to women and girls, not only in paper. I keep emphasizing this because so many people write things very well, but in practice, it's a different story. You'll find that even though their project documents are saying this, and they even have phrases saying we are a feminist organization, even practically within the way they deliver their programming, there aren't any feminist principles in there. Feminist principles are not observed and not lived. And then at the point of implementation, you find that a lot of work that is happening is again reinforcing the very gender power hierarchies and injustices that the women's rights organizations have been working for many decades to undo. Next. Yes, so I think that's what Evelyn and I had for you. Now it's your turn to ask any burning questions that you have. And remember, just as we said at the beginning of the program, you can raise your hand by clicking on that icon to speak directly to us, or you can type in your question in the text box. Or we can have, let's listen to the questions.
Okay, great. Hi, Evelyn and Tina. This is Lauren. Thank you for a really fantastic and informative presentation. So as they said, you can feel free to raise your hand and I can unmute you if you'd like to ask a question. But for now, we do have a question that came through the chat box. And this is, during the promoting women's leadership slide, it was mentioned that women are often not part of work programming and decision-making due to education limitations, but that we should work with these challenges, find ways around them and ways to address them. And we'd love to hear some practical examples in this regard. Thanks.
Tina, you want to go or do you think I should go first?
You can go first or add.
Okay, so I think I did say that. And perhaps I can, for example, share of work that we are doing with an organization that I'm supporting in South Sudan. And so this organization is sort of working with community mobilizers like activists to try and start have conversations about violence and also facilitate awareness raising on the existing referral pathway. So when I did monitoring visit, I find that of 16 community mobilizers, they have 4 women and they have 12 men. And so they say, oh, you know, our criteria was you should be able to write because we need monthly reports and also our review meetings. These women are not able to contribute. And so I was asking, why are we holding review meetings in English? Yeah, because we speak Juba Arabic in this area. So I imagine everybody speaks this. So we stop using the excuse of women are not speaking English. The next thing I ask about reports. So the women cannot write reports in English. Can they write it in the local language? Yeah, yes, but it will be a lot of work for us to translate. And I'm like, that can totally be one of the things we do on our job description if we really need the reports from there. But better still, women don't have to write. If I raise awareness and I do all these things, you can hold a monthly review meeting where I share with you the activity that I did, what I picked up, how many people are engaged, what are some of my challenges, and program officers in the organization take those notes and are able to sort of feed back to us and say, this is what is coming up. It is not neat. Sometimes our M&E people will come hard on us. But again, as I said, if we are looking at feminist organizing, if we are looking at the constituency that we are genuinely serving, and we want to be true to bringing in the voices and fostering leadership, then there are certain compromises that we have to make along the way. And so I'm not saying that, you know, we certainly should not have any criteria, but we have to be cognizant that the criteria we set for programming, you know, for our staffing and all this does not continuously exclude women. The same is sometimes for the staff that we recruit in some of the areas that we work in. They are not the smartest because all the time they will be saying, oh, the men did much better in the interviews. But you're looking for a case manager to do GBV, a response at some women-friendly space, and you need a woman there. And so sometimes we want to be able to say, does she have the right attitude? Does she believe in the work that she's doing? And is it okay for us to take her on and know that she is not going to say the things we need to say, but we are going to have to invest in her so that she's able to learn and do the work as part of our contribution to the movement, and then, you know, who knows what will come out of her. So I think what I meant by that is like just kind of like, you know, dropping sometimes the standards because we need to live with the realities, but look at the bigger picture of what is it that we want to address and how to focus our work, not at individual cases of women, but at looking at the structures of patriarchy and how we can look at that. And I think that is why in some programming we start to see people saying, if you are having groups of women that are working as community mobilizers, let there be some literacy classes where they can start to learn how to read and write as a life skill, so that they can also at least tomorrow be able to count 1, 2, 3 and say a few things. So I think there are those little things we can do when we demonstrate the commitment and see why it is important. Thank you very much.
Maybe just to add to what Evelyn was saying, we still need to recognize that a lot of women out there are still grappling with the gender roles and all the other gender issues. And that's why we have the programming needs to be more deliberate about growing and grooming the women to grow as leaders. Because if we don't do that, again, women's skills and contribution are being taken for granted again by disregarding the fact that they are still grappling with a lot of these issues and trying to put them against men's. Like, for example, the reason I say this, I see out there of the people that we work with, the woman still has to take care of the children and her husband and blah, blah, and then we expect her to perform at the same rate with the man who is having a lot of free time on his case. So we still need to be deliberate at grooming the women and also supporting them to grow as leaders and believe in them. Let's identify the skills that they are very good at for them to take it forward, even at the very community level.
Hi, it's Noelle from Toronto, and I just wanted to add a specific example of using different recruitment methods as was just said about finding ways to put more emphasis on the practical skills that that are needed, particularly in sort of like field level jobs and roles. And so, for example, like, you know, a caseworker, maybe putting less emphasis on recruitment criteria that emphasizes educational, academic sort of standards, and using alternative recruitment methods that actually test out practical skills, such as, you know, skills like, you know, empathy, ability to listen, and giving weight to the fact that, you know, we need women to listen to other women. And so that's just one tiny aspect of recruitment and recruitment at a certain level. But I think, you know, there are tools that can be used that really help to kind of lay bare kind of the talents and the, you know, apply a different lens to decision making about recruitment. Anyway, that's a whole other conversation in and of itself, but I'd be interested to hear other experiences around that.
Thank you.
We have another question from Barbara, which is, given high emphasis on male engagement from donors and having limited experience with that, it would be great to hear about more potential pitfalls in engaging men and boys in GBV prevention and response.
Okay, maybe I can run first. Evelyn can also.
Sure.
Yes. Now, if I still use my Uganda example, we've seen cases where a whole group of people are working on men engaged, prioritizing the men engaged work, and they are working with men alone. And these men have not been taken through a gender transformative training, and they haven't changed at all. So when they go out there, they are telling women to be, if they want to avoid being beaten by their husbands, they need to be more submissive, cook the food on time. And here in Uganda, there's this whole acceptability of male infidelity. So they tell the women, do not even ask about where your husbands have been, even disregarding the fact that we are struggling with high levels of HIV infection and hepatitis B. So they say, if your husband is hidden somewhere with another woman, what's your problem to try to find out? Just don't disturb your husband as long as he's providing food. Be a good woman and everything will be fine. Then again, they are beginning to bring the discourse that the laws are not favoring men. And they're saying that all the services are women friendly, which is not true. Women have the worst experience here in Uganda when they go to seek for example, justice services. They are extremely unfriendly with laws that still don't look at men and women as equal. And even the system or the entire procedure is extremely difficult and shameful for women to access justice if, for example, they've been raped or beaten or at the points of divorce. So all these are extremely difficult situations. And again, in Uganda, there was the men engaged strategy of requiring pregnant women to come with their partners for antenatal services. That would have been really a nice thing, but they did not do it in the right way, because then at the point when women would go to seek for services, they would ask the husband. So whoever has not come with a partner is either served last or not attended to. And the ones who come with partners are even given free services, and immediately their needs are addressed. So why would women's right to access to medication be conditioned on the presence of men? I think that's the first point of mistake. And then secondly, men and women in Uganda, because of the acceptance of male infidelity, men and men, even though they are formally married to a wife, they are having other women who they've made pregnant, but then they don't want to show up with them for anyone to know that they are the fathers of these children. So now these women, because of the negative response of some of the healthcare workers, they resorted to a very difficult situation of hiring men. You know, they pay money to come with a man who will act as a partner. Now that is giving the wrong information to the health system that this is a couple. And that's the first point. And then secondly, this woman is again going to be beaten by the husband, because the other people who have seen her come with a foreign man will say, oh, that pregnancy is not yours. It belongs to the other man who she goes with to the health center. And all these are like extremely harmful. We need to do it well in a way that we involve men, but without creating harm, further harm for women. Maybe Evelyn can add.
Yeah, so, I mean, just a couple of things for me. The first is that I think that the value of engaging men is not anything that we are questioning. I think the issue is, I think, more on what are we engaging men about, how are we engaging men, and how do they stay accountable to women and girls. So you specifically talked about some of the pitfalls. And for me, one of the things that I have noticed is that it is very easy, if not well managed and premised within the broader framework of human rights and gender equality and patriarchy, for discussions with men to easily become about them. So it starts about also our experiences, but too much is now focusing on women. Now there is no need for this affirmative action. So we really need, people that understand this that we are talking about, so that those conversations are structured and redirected to a feminist and power analysis and, taken from that framework. The other thing that I see about men engagement is that if it is done without recognition of internalized oppression of women, that it is very easy to bring mixed groups where men start to dominate discussions. And so how we engage men sort of like requires a lot of caution, because it kind of like really reinforces power imbalances in some of the programming that we are having. And then I think the other thing that for me, I see also a lot is that because of the social power imbalances, there are very few people, including staff and community mobilizers, that can call out patriarchy, that they can recognize sexism and are able to call men to order in engaging with men. So it's a lot more to do with the skill set that is required and the analysis and understanding on what is it that we are engaging men on and how can we engage men on. Men and in a way that's accountable to women and girls. So I think that if we are engaging men in a way that we stay true to the overall goal of preventing violence against women and girls and dismantling patriarchy, then I think we are on the right course. If we are engaging in men in ways in which we are creating opportunities for women to engage in decision-making and leadership together with men, then I think we are on the right course. If we are able to support men to start questioning masculinities and start to see themselves as partners to women and start to question the way in which they behave and use their power, then I think it is on the right course. So I think there are certain things that we can do and we need to do in working with men if we are going to stay true to accountability to women and girls.
Thank you for that. I wanted to go back for a second to what Noelle had asked during her sharing, but we recognize that some people may have to sign off, but we would love to hear from participants about any examples of challenges to accountability that you have encountered and how you've navigated them in your own contexts, if you'd like to share. Sorry, Noelle, I'm trying to unmute you, but I'm having a problem. It's not allowing me for some reason. Would you like to type something in the chat box? Or Divya, perhaps you can try to unmute Noelle.
Okay, did that work?
Yes, I can hear you now. Thank you.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. It's Noelle from Toronto, and I just wanted to add that I think that often sort of program models for engaging men and women and that try to sort of foster a certain type of dialogue between men and women on an equitable basis don't always factor in the consideration that you know, men and women do not start from the same. We don't have the same starting point, and there's such a deeper level of breaking of silence and stigma that I think needs to happen with groups of women, where they can actually begin to sort of name the practices and behaviors and attitudes that they find unacceptable, and that they can, you know, whether or not they use the word violence. And I think that it's, and just a small thing there, but I think also, I mean, I don't have a specific example. Well, I do, but I have many of them. But just it's such a common thing to attend a training on gender equality where you see that the men who are present are, you know, saying all of the right things and not sort of on an intellectual level, you know, making all of the right sounds and sort of parroting some of the discourse, but at the same time, you know, not having that awareness that you are using all of the space in the room to speak, that you're using, that you have given, you know, 3 square inches to the intern to sit at the same desk as you, you know, that that there isn't that critical reflection of their use of power, and that it's often that it seems as though, you know, any sort of behavior change that happens is very much on an individual level and very much on their terms. And so it would be really interesting to hear also practices where people have found ways around that, or other examples of those sort of challenges. Thanks.
Hello?
Hi, do we have any other people that would like to share at this time? If there are no further questions, I believe we can move on to the feedback slide.
Okay, so thank you very much for the very active participation. I think this has been a very good one. We would like to really hear about your feedback. We hope that you can take a few minutes to complete the following questionnaire. It's really short, to inform us on how you found the session. And remember, everything will stay anonymous, so just don't fear to be as honest as possible. Next. You can also stay in touch. Those are all links and handles that you can reach us on. And please, we have quite a number of other Knowledge Summit sessions. I'm not sure if we mentioned that at the beginning. Maybe if we can just run back to the slide that shows the other list, or we could send to every participant the other list of the other Knowledge Summit that you can also call on other people to participate in. Thank you very, very much. We truly appreciate all this and wish you all the best.
And thank you very much for participating, all of you, and have a nice evening, day, morning, wherever you are.